In February of 2005, the Ransom Center opened to the public the Woodward and Bernstein Watergate papers. Since that time, students, scholars, historians, and journalists have used these papers to learn more about not only one of the most significant crises in presidential history, but also about First Amendment rights and freedom of the press, executive power, and the limits of the presidency, and other issues related to American politics, history, and journalism. This rich collection has begun to contribute to an interdisciplinary research agenda on our campus and in the wider scholarly community. Today, in support of this developing research agenda, the Ransom Center hosts its second symposium on Watergate, titled The Legacy of Watergate, Why It Still Matters. One could even add in why it's still timely. We are pleased to have Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein with us today to discuss issues of presidential accountability and the media with our distinguished panelists. Let me take this moment to thank Carl and Bob for their establishment of the Woodward and Bernstein Endowment to support future programs related to this archive. I would also like to thank the members of our academic committee who helped plan this program. Committee members include Bruce Buchanan, Professor of Government, David Oshinsky, Professor of History, Roderick Hart, Dean of the College of Communication, and Frank Gavin, Associate Professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. We're grateful to the Austin Statesman for their generous sponsorship of this event and their editor, Rich Oppel, for agreeing to serve as one of our panelists. Our first panel of the afternoon is titled Watergate and Presidential Accountability. It will be moderated by Bruce Buchanan, Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. Buchanan's specialties include the study of presidential politics, American political institutions, and public policy. He's written widely and well on these topics and is the author of several books, including The Presidential Experience, What the Office Does to the Man, The Citizen's Presidency, Standards of Choice and Judgment, and finally, The Policy Partnership, Presidential Elections and American Democracy. I'm pleased to welcome Bruce Buchanan, who will introduce the panelists.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you. So let me get right to our introductions of the panelists, beginning with our guests. Bob Woodward, to my immediate left, is Assistant Managing Editor at the Washington Post, and he has authored or co-authored many national bestsellers, most recently 3 on the current Bush administration, including State of Denial. And this body of work makes him something of a one-man presidential accountability agent. Carl Bernstein was the co-author with Bob of 2 bestsellers on Watergate, All the President's Men and The Final Days. And since leaving the Washington Post, Carl has worked as a senior correspondent for the ABC network, taught at New York University. He has authored or co-authored several other books and articles and is currently at work on a biography of Hillary Clinton. Sanford Levinson, to my immediate right, holds the W. St. John Garwood and the W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Texas Law School. And he is also my colleague in the government department. He is a prolific author of scholarly and popular articles and books, and most recently has written a book entitled Our Undemocratic Constitution. Frank Gavin, seated to Sandy's right, is professor of public policy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas. And Frank brings expertise in national security policy and presidential history to our discussions. He too has authored many scholarly articles, and his most recent book deals with the fiscal side of the Cold War and is entitled Gold, Dollars, and Power, the Politics of International Monetary Relations. So we have a distinguished group of experts on the subject before us today, and we will proceed by me asking questions of the panel, asking each panelist to respond briefly, individually, to each question before we proceed to a general discussion of that question and then move on to another question. And the first question I'd like to put before the panel is intended to give us all some big picture guidance on why presidents abuse power. And of course, we're very interested to hear from our distinguished visitors their assessment of why it is that Watergate happened in the first place. But it's also of interest, I think, for us to think a little bit about why presidents other than Richard Nixon fairly repeatedly get into Watergate-like abuse of power difficulties. And, you know, the questions that occur to me as I raise these possibilities: is it presidential personality? Is it institutional incentives of some sort associated with the presidency itself? Or is it something else like the atmosphere of urgency surrounding national security issues? Bob, would you start us off on this? Why did Watergate happen?
Oh, wow. First of all, it has a lot to do with Nixon's personality. He loved other people's secrets. He knew they were important because he had so many secrets and knew they were important. But also, you have to go to the time in really early 1972 when they set in motion the Watergate operations. If you look at what was going on in American politics then, it was the Vietnam War. And it looked like Nixon was vulnerable, that some Democrat like Muskie, who was kind of the front runner at the time, might beat him. And so they launched the operations really in part to derail Muskie. And I think one of the things that's forgotten is how successful it was, because McGovern was nominated.
Carl?
I'll try to answer your question generally, rather,
Okay.
because I think Bob's answered that very well. But I would say all of the above to your question generally about why presidents abuse their power, with one addition, and that is a simple, almost universal human desire to control one's environment. And that's a very rarefied environment when you get to the Oval Office. What we are seeing today, you mentioned all these abuses of power by various presidents, but I think that the import of them is very varied, and that what we are seeing today is an abuse of power in this administration that is even more egregious than in the Nixon administration because of its consequences and because it has gone unchecked.
That is a subject on the minds of many that I'm sure we'll come back to. Sandy?
2 quick points. We're all familiar with the adage, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but I pick up on what Bob Woodward said. John Roach, a political scientist who was an assistant to Lyndon Johnson, added his own twist to this: power corrupts, and the prospect of losing power corrupts absolutely. And I think this is one reason why we sometimes speak of benevolent despots who, 18th century, who didn't have to worry about losing power, but presidents, for a variety of reasons, do. And I also think this dovetails with what Gerhard Casper, former law professor at Chicago, now at Stanford, former president of Stanford, describes as the increasingly Caesarist nature of the presidency, in part because, you mentioned 72 election. One of the things that made that a watershed was the importance of primary systems, ever more importance of television, campaigning, the degree of megalomania that is attached to running for president in the first place, the being surrounded with sycophants who reinforce the view of the candidate that they really are the indispensable person to save us from whatever the menace of the day is. And then the fear of losing power that I think begins literally the moment of election. So, in addition to the personality factor, with Richard Nixon, it's impossible not to talk about the personality, but I think that there are these structural factors as well that are very, very important. Probably the least neurotic or the president least afflicted by this was Gerald Ford, who in some ways really was an accidental president. He never ran for the office. He never would have thought of running for this office. I think he had a sense of due modesty about himself. But I don't think that, given the way we select presidents, that it selects out people who have kind of a realistic sense of their own limitations, as well as what they can
So
offer.
in an interesting way, Ford didn't get a chance, didn't have enough time to become crazy.
Yeah.
Frank?
Historians often like to look at both short-term, proximate causes and long-term causes in these things. And I think it's clear from these comments that you can't separate Watergate from the personality of Richard Nixon. But I do think it is important to think about some of these structural causes. One of the fun counterfactuals to play is, if Nixon had been elected in 1960, would you have had a Watergate-like scandal? And there's certainly some evidence to lead you to think, because of his personality, there might have been. But I think the structural factors, looking at the late 1960s and early 1970s, and to see the political climate that we were in, both Bob and Carl mentioned this, I think there's two factors that are particularly important. By the late 60s, early 70s, there was just an increased cultural and political bitterness over Vietnam. And this had started with LBJ, and you saw the beginning of the loss of faith in institutions pretty much across the board. And the second thing that I think few people recall, but the United States was operating in an environment where they were a declining power, where Richard Nixon had to manage U.S. foreign policy at a time where the U.S., for the first time in quite some time, was not able to dictate what it wanted to do in the world. And those two factors certainly by no means excuse Nixon's monstrous behavior. But I think it's important to keep those two important structural factors in mind when trying to make sense of what happened.
Would it be fair to say that this atmosphere of anxiety surrounding national security is especially salient in understanding why presidents would
Yes. I mean, I think
cross lines?
this is something that comes up again and again in history, where either through some perceived threat or imagined threat, there's the power of the executive. The executive reaches out for more power. Congress either decides to allow that or not allow that. But very often it's the national security issues that are the battleground over these issues of power and lead to, I think, such abuses of power.
Carl and Bob, can you see any rationale or justification whatsoever for what Nixon did in the context of the kind of pressures Frank described?
No. Zero. And
Let me,
a
I
point
was not
Carl,
justifying what Nixon was doing.
No, I didn't mean to say
Right,
justify,
right.
but
Just
to
to
say
be clear,
explain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not a
But,
Nixon apologist.
a point Carl made early in the period we were working on the Watergate story is that it really was an assault on the electoral system. It really was vote tampering. When you lay out all of the spying, espionage, sabotage directed at the Democratic candidates, it was incredibly disruptive and effective. And some of it, when it first came out in our stories, people thought it was funny.
Well, the first story that we did, the first story of the real importance, I think, that we did actually on this was about Howard Hunt, the Watergate burglar, doing research on Teddy Kennedy. And Kennedy, in fact, was the candidate they feared the most.
That's right. And it later came out that one of the things Hunt had done is forged cables to show that President John Kennedy had been responsible for Diem's assassination in Vietnam. But in the immediate presidential election, the things they did were, as I was starting to say, kind of trivial, sending 200 pizzas just someplace, and all of a sudden 200 pizzas arrive. No one has the money to pay for them. Incredibly effective. Some of the other seemingly silly things they would do when the Muskie campaign would go out on a trip out of town in hotels where you leave your shoes outside the door. Well, Segretti hired people to go around at 2 a.m. and take everyone's shoes. Now, you think that's not a problem, but if it's
Try
all...
the snow of New Hampshire.
Right. And no one brings an extra pair of shoes, so you have 50 people in the Muskie campaign looking for shoes. They would go in a motor caravan, would pull up to some event and go in, and the drivers would leave the car idling with the keys in it, and they'd turn the cars off, take the keys out of every car.
We're on to
So that-
something
yeah.
that I think some of the other, excuse me, panelists alluded to, and that is the evolution of our political system into a kind of warfare in itself. And that is a more modern tendency, that until the Eisenhower election and after that, I don't think we had the kind, and also we didn't have the kind of media concentration and expense until the 60s, until the presidential debates, until perception became a whole question separate from reality, and that this idea that you are in a state of war when you're running for president carries over to the whole process, and it carries over to the governance, but more than anything, it starts us down a path where truth is, as in warfare, the first casualty.
That's no doubt true. And certainly the Congress, in response to Watergate and Vietnam, was quite decisive. When presidents abuse their power, Congress does often push back. In the aftermath of Watergate, Congress passed legislation like the War Powers Act, the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, much in the news of late, the Ethics in Government Act, which led to the special prosecutor system. And this gives rise to a question I'd be interested in hearing our panel comment on regarding how effectively the Congress dealt with Watergate. Did Congress overreact with restrictive legislation that constrained the presidency too much? In other words, do President Bush and Vice President Cheney, who complained about that, have a point? Carl, you want to start us on that one?
No, particularly. First of all, I think that their complaint is not about that kind of constraint. Their complaint has been that Watergate and the Vietnam War weakened the country, and that therefore an assertion of presidential power subject to almost no constraints was necessary to counterbalance something that was going on in the political system, and that the president couldn't operate without it. But I don't think they were talking so much about things like the Ethics in Government Act as a general atmosphere in which there was accountability through truthfulness. They didn't like the newspaper stories.
Well, yeah, but they're complaining about the War Powers Act,
right.
the Budget Act, and for a long time.
I'm saying, though, that what I'm saying is that their complaints are really a red herring, especially in the case of this administration.
Did Congress overreact?
And I think, again, I think the answer is no, because I think you have to look at it as a continuum. The Congress in Watergate acted with great responsibility by having the Irvin hearings and the impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon. Thereafter, the Congress, in its attempt to exercise the prerogatives of the legislative branch, sought ways in which overreaching would be constrained. And in response to that, presidents and other people in the government tried to find loopholes in the acts. Was some of the legislation very badly drawn, like the Ethics in Government Act? Absolutely. The special prosecutor became uncontrollable. And clearly you had to have some kind of ability rein him in. But generally, it seems to me that if you look, for instance, at the campaign finance laws, they found loopholes that I don't think, was there bad legislation? Yes. Was it an overreaction to the problem? No.
No. Okay. Sandy, how do you see it?
I basically agree. This administration, and I come back to my comment a moment ago about a Caesarist presidency, it objects to any limitations at all. Its conception of the presidency, and actually some of the, what we now know to call royal bushies, like John Yoo, are quite willing to say this in print. Their conception of the president and of Article 2 is of a Hanoverian monarch. It's an elected monarch for 4 years, and there is the accountability that comes with elections. But these are not people who will recognize any constraints when the president purports to think it's important for some national interest or whatever. So, I think we could have a very worthwhile discussion on whether every piece of legislation was written perfectly, and as Carl says, it wasn't, and we could fine-tune some stuff. And undoubtedly, we could agree that there's some legislation that might impinge too much on the presidency, but that's not really what this administration is about. It's resisting limitations at all. Secondly, I think it's a mistake to talk about Congress performing its role in the 70s, because I think that it is a reality that it's the Democrats who controlled Congress and who performed a role that in part was generated by party incentives. James Madison argued in the 51st Federalist that the basic theory of checks and balances, that Congress will inevitably, because of its own institutional interests, counterbalance the presidency. But that's false. And it really became false no later than 1800 with the rise of the party system. So that, although I do not view the impeachment of Richard Nixon as a Democratic plot, and I applaud what happened to President Nixon, nonetheless, I think it has to be recognized that it never would have happened had the Republicans controlled Congress.
But you've got to make a distinction between initiating the investigations and following through as they were developing very concrete information about what had gone on.
And I think this brings up a second point, that the party system in the late 60s, early 70s was a much more fluid party system than it is now. For a variety of reasons, the curves of the two parties, in fact, intersected.
Well, you didn't have an ideological divide, except coming with the Goldwater election that you have now. But I want to disagree with something you said, and that is about the role of the Democrats as if the Republicans had nothing to do with the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Yes, it was initiated, the Watergate investigation, by a Democratic Congress. And at the same time, the Republicans on that committee, from Howard Baker on, they saw that they had a duty as well. And they rose above partisanship, most of them. And it was the Republicans that saw their future going out the window, among other things, but also for the right reasons. Barry Goldwater marched down to the White House with other Republican leaders and told Nixon they were going to vote against him in the Senate. Can you imagine that happening? A delegation of Republicans going down to the White House today to tell George Bush he's got to start to obey the law.
Seems less likely for sure.
But so that gets to my next question. I just would like to frame this discussion, and I think that the professor has raised an interesting thing, and that is that this administration, I think, is not evolutionary. I think it's sui generis, in that its unwillingness to embrace the truth and recognize the truth, and its objection to the truth about anything, whether it's Katrina and the president's response to it, and for instance saying, well, there was no way of knowing that the levees we're going to break, when in fact there's a tape that's right on television of the president being briefed about how the levees can break. That we are dealing here with a level of untruthfulness that is so constant that it is exceeding what we saw in the Nixon presidency, and it determines everything that we're talking about, including the deaths of thousands and thousands of our people and others.
This is something we might come back to. Frank, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is coming up and what is behind your question is what is the cause? You talked about, and the comments have mentioned, there's cycles where this seems to happen, where there's this battle between the executive and Congress and this back and forth. And the reason, and this is why I'd love to hear the answer from our esteemed guests about what they think a Nixon presidency in 1960 would have been like, because it's clear that there are these abuses of power. To what extent do they have to do with the personalities of the people involved? To what extent do they have to do with the particular cultural and political environment? To what extent do they have to do with the structure of power? I actually disagree a bit with Sandy about how the executive and Congress has battled for power, I think, in the last 100 years. I think there are many times where the executive is set up to be pretty weak. During times of national emergency, we sort of de facto let them go. And then when there's that transition out, there's a period of great stress and tension. We have a tendency to forget that immediately after 9/11, people were furious at the fact that intelligence agencies appeared to miss this attack. And a lot of what people, and certainly came out in the 9/11 Commission report, was that their inability to cooperate, their inability to have discussions with each other, to share intelligence, some of that emerged from this 1970s legislation. That's not to say it's right or wrong, but I think it's important to move this conversation to identify the causes.
Yeah.
Is it just Nixon and Bush are bad people? Is it that the cultural and political times created this, or is there something in the structure of the American political system that leads to this?
The common thread is a war.
Right. I would
And
agree with that.
the connection between the war that Nixon was fighting, which he'd inherited, Vietnam, and the one particularly in Iraq that Bush initiated, in that context, when you report on either of those White Houses, you find a sense on the part of the president and the people working for him that, my God, we've got this awful war, we've got to do everything possible, there are no limits, and then there are people up in Congress passing things like the War Powers Act, asking for notification, asking for timelines and so forth, and that looks absurd to them. And the great difficulty is that in fighting that war, the presidents become so sure they're doing the right thing that there's no other alternative. One of the interviews I did with President Bush, and this is not a question I asked, though I'm asking why the Iraq War, and he just sat in the Oval Office and he said, literally, I believe we have a duty to free people, to liberate people. Now, as you know, Sandy, it's nowhere in the Constitution that we are supposed to liberate people. There's no law that I know that was passed. But he jumps in his chair when he says, duty. Now, that's a big word, maybe the biggest word in the English language for a president. And so consumed with that self-righteousness and certitude, gee, this is the right course, no one's going to get in his way, let alone the press or the Congress or, in fact, the public in terms of public opinion.
Well, now we're talking about psychological factors, among other things. And it seems to me that one of the things that Nixon and Bush II, and contrast Bush I and Bush II in this regard, that Nixon and Bush II share, is a psychological unfitness for the presidency. Demonstrable.
Dr. Bernstein has...
Dr. Woodward has talked many times about Nixon's psychological unfitness, and so I'm furthering the diagnosis. And in so doing, though, I want to try and make it fact-based. Because part of the problem with our discussion of the Bush administration in this country is that it's not fact-based enough, and a lot of what I'm saying might not sound fact-based. But I think if we go back and look at the demonstrable record of what the president has said and what he has done, of what Mr. Cheney has said and what he has done, of what this White House has said and Condoleezza Rice has said and what they have done, there is a demonstrable record. And that is not opinion, and that we need to bring our discussions conceptually to that central fact. That this,
You two would have two different explanations. For you, it's war. For you, these are monstrous personalities, and that's an important difference.
No,
That
it's
they're-
not that they're monstrous
Or
personalities.
that they're psychologically unsuited.
I think both of us agree that Nixon was psychologically unfit for the presidency. You've said it. In fact, I might have even picked it up from you. I was reluctant to say it till you came out with it.
I don't.
You were
Now
the first.
that's a restraint no one will find credible.
You go back and you'll
yeah.
find out you said it first.
Here's the problem with, and this is revealed in the Nixon tapes, and Carl and I have not listened to or read them all, but we are the only people who have Nixon tapes on cassettes, and we play them in our automobile.
In the car.
Driving around instead of music.
That's right.
But you see that this,
Better than hip hop.
Nixon, in his own words, regularly orders crimes, abuse of power. But what, and you were the one who was onto this the earliest, what the tapes show is a smallness of personality, that it's always about him. How do I use the power of the presidency to screw some enemy or pay off some big political contributor? It was almost as if the presidency became an instrument of personal revenge. Now, in the case of Bush, what Bush is doing is fighting this war in his own mind. He is convinced that it is absolutely necessary and absolutely right. I agree. I would not give a psychiatric diagnosis, but I would agree with Carl that when you look at it, and I think I've spent as much time as anyone, what they said and what they did, it is shocking, the difference that secret reports come in saying the level of violence in Iraq is going up and up and up to the point last spring where there were 4 attacks, terrorist attacks on U.S. forces or Iraqi authorities for an hour. 100 attacks a day, 700, 800 attacks a week. An unimaginable number until this year when it got up to about 7 an hour. At this time, the president and the other people you mentioned, particularly the vice president, are out saying, we have turned the corner in Iraq. As Cheney said, the terrorists are in the last throes, and at the same time, secret reports are coming in saying it's getting worse. It's going to get worse next year. This was in 2006, which is exactly what's happened. But I wouldn't bring them all together and say they're exactly alike. The alarming thing about this war is, as you pointed out, the consequence, but it's not just a few months or a couple of years of untruth-telling.
No.
It is 4 years
That's right. But
of not telling the truth.
Look at Katrina, though. Look at Katrina as, that's what interests me. How is it that a domestic event is subject to exactly the same technique and exactly the same pattern as this war? So it becomes more than trying to liberate. That's my point.
If I could,
What
I'd like to
about
jump in
liberating
here.
the people
Okay, yeah,
of New
go ahead.
Orleans?
We're conducting that.
And the reason I want to jump in is because this is a good moment to try to broaden this beyond just Mr. Nixon and put it into the context of the impact of Watergate and the Congress's treatment of Watergate on the practices of all the presidents that followed Nixon, including Ford, Carter, Reagan, the first Bush, Clinton, and of course the second Bush. Frank, how would you characterize that impact? Has it, to put it another way, has Watergate's impact on the actual behavior of presidents been, Watergate and the handling of Watergate, has it been positive, neutral, or negative?
Well, I think jumping on Carl Bernstein's answer, if we had Watergate and we had George Bush and these things are true, then clearly not, right? Because the system then didn't work. How did we get George Bush after Watergate? I mean, clearly, the political and cultural environment since the late 60s and early 70s is far more poisoned. It's far more culturally riven. There's a lot less, every poll shows much less faith in our political institutions. There's more legalism. I mean, I think what's always fascinating is if you should chart how many lawyers work for different agencies now compared to, you look at something like the National Security Council and you see how many lawyers worked under the Kennedy administration and how many work there now just handling legal issues. It's exploded. And perhaps, given this story that we've heard, I think the most damaging effect has been to decrease the talent pool of potential politicians.
Increase or decrease?
Decrease,
Right.
Dramatically
Right.
decrease. And so I think you overall have this larger cynicism about institutions with the presidency, right? People expect so much less than they once did. I wouldn't limit it to the presidency. I'd say all the polling shows people feel less faith in Congress. I would even include the media. You know, most people don't have great faith in the media as an institution. You know, and so clearly things are worse than they were. And there's nothing to signal, especially if this is to be believed, that this is getting any better.
And it's, the impact is worse for presidents. Sandy, how do you, worse on presidents?
No, I think it's as was suggested by John Connolly in the 70s. What lesson did he take from Watergate? His answer
In Washington, we
but I want to go back to Howard Baker for just a moment, because I think he gave a very loyal Republican.
He did.
And when he started the mantra of what did the president know and when did he know it, I think he was quite certain that there would not eventuate what needed to be a gun. When the evidence was overwhelming, then he rose to what we would describe as nonpartisanship or bipartisanship. But I think that that whole mantra and the whole notion that if you didn't find a smoking gun, it would be all right, was destructive. And it's just a happy accident that Alexander Butterfield testified honestly about the existence of the tapes, and then they indeed hadn't been burnt and the information came out. I agree with Frank about the cost of legalization, but I'd put it somewhat differently. I think that one of the very, very high costs of Watergate is to legalize the notion of impeachment. So I will put in a very brief plug for my book, a section of which is why it's better to have a criminal than an incompetent as president. And the answer is that if you've got a criminal, and especially if there's smoking gun evidence that the person's a criminal, we have a language to get rid of that person. But I think one of the things that unites all of us in this panel is the unfitness of the current president to be in this office. We can give a variety of different reasons for that. But the very same editorials or columns that say, isn't it really terrible that we have another 670 days or so in his term, all treat it as there's just nothing we can do. And unless you can pin a criminal offense on Bush, and frankly, I don't know that you can. And ironically enough, one of the costs of the Clinton impeachment is that his defenders weren't, said, well, perjury really isn't a crime. But even if it is a crime, it isn't a high crime and misdemeanor. And so unless it's a certain kind of crime, then we're stuck with a person in the White House. And I think that's a terrible feature of our political system.
You said something really important, and that is that the legacy of the smoking gun is the worst of the legal legacies to come out of the process of impeachment. Because you're right, that Nixon would not, in all likelihood, have had to leave office had it not been for that smoking gun. And that precedent is a terrible one.
Bob, you're the author of a book, Shadow, in which you address this question I raised quite specifically for each one of these presidents. Could you kind of summarize what you find about the impact of Watergate on those folks?
Well, all of the presidents after Nixon responded somewhat differently, but they didn't like the constraint of the Independent Counsel Act, understandably, which, when it came up for renewal, no one, absolutely no one in the House or Senate proposed renewing it. It just died because it had a year when it had to either be reenacted or it would die. I find it interesting what the presidents after Nixon learned or thought they learned from Watergate. And take President Clinton. His response to Watergate was, in many ways, to learn the lesson, don't confide in anyone.
No notes.
Yeah, no notes, no tapes. And if you think about it, in the Lewinsky matter, the people who could have testified against him, Monica Lewinsky, his secretary Betty Curry, and his friend Vernon Jordan, all did testify and said, he never told me to destroy anything. He never told me to do anything illegal. There was much concealment, there was much embarrassment, but there was no act. And so, that's a strange lesson to take away from Watergate, but in practice, that's what he did.
Well, I sense, as I listen to each of the panelists discuss the impacts of Watergate on the system and on the operation of presidential accountability, that there's so much unhappiness with it, and that leads me to the next question I'd like to pose generally to the group, which is that the system is not ideal the way it's set up now. It has a quality of cyclicity to it, or a kind of a pendulum-like effect in which we have a period of relatively lax accountability, such as existed right before Watergate. Then Watergate comes along, and then we have a substantial tightening, during which time presidents are constrained with more or less success, followed by the emergence of some crisis, like 9/11, which lead to cries for heroic leadership. And of course, the accountability system has to track these events in one way or another. So what you have is this situation in which, pendulum-like, the system kind of tightens the screws for a while, then they loosen again in response to a crisis and a strengthening of a presidency, and then they're tightened again. And my question is this the best way to operate the accountability system? Sandy's kind of anticipated this by saying that it's, the impeachment feature needs to be modified. Carl, why don't you start us on that?
We haven't talked about we've disconnected all of this from the people of the country. We haven't talked for a moment about the people of the country. And it's not totally incidental that these things have happened. And first of all, people have voted for these presidents. And in all but one case, a majority. And
how do you really feel about
right. No, that's about the court. That's not about Bush. But I have this view that the system is broken in a much larger way. The electoral system itself is broken. First of all, Sandy has raised this point. Think of it. We have 300 million people in this country, and look who the people are who have sought the office of president, of late especially. Look at the class of candidates and how narrowly they fit into the ideological warfare that we're in the midst of. They come from within this system. They've been willing to go through this system. We've had a primary system, it's getting a little better this time, in which basically the people of the country have almost nothing to do with choosing the president, because by the time it gets to New York or California, the nominees of each party have been chosen. So the people have been excluded really from participation meaningfully in choosing our leaders. Then you have the role of money in politics, which really is driving so much. We have an ideological, cultural war going on in the country that has been going on for some time. And on top of that, we have a media environment that makes it very hard for thoughtful discourse and consideration to get through. So all of this together, this cacophony and all of these rules, and we have no draft. I would suggest that if we had a draft, there would be no war. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that there are so few, I don't know what the number is, it's fewer than 25, I believe, kids of members of Congress serving in Iraq.
Yeah, a lot fewer than 25.
I'm waiting for the Bush girls to go over there and re-up. So all of these factors contribute to a corrosion and a breakdown of our system, particularly the role of money in politics. Until we find a way of funding, Mr. Smith could not go to Washington today. Couldn't have happened. He's got to first come up with $150 million before Mr. Smith can go to Washington.
If I can jump in on this. First of all, unfortunately, it's not only George Bush who didn't have the majority vote. Since World War II, Harry Truman,
That's
John
right.
Kennedy, Richard Nixon in 1968,
Right.
Bill Clinton in both his elections.
Clinton had
We have a
41%.
screwy
Right.
way of electing presidents, so that it is at least as common that people get to the White House with less than 50% of the vote,
Right.
of those who vote. We won't even talk about people who don't, as that they have any plausible mandate. And then this goes back actually to the very first question of why it is that people who get to the White House with 49% or 42% or the like would indeed be fearful of losing power. Secondly, I think every bit as bad as the role of money in presidential politics is partisan gerrymandering, particularly in the House, which is one of the things that explains the culture in the current House.
You mean guaranteed incumbency?
Guaranteed incumbency, and the fact that you will draw, basically, most districts in the House of Representatives are one-party districts. The number of competitive races in the House is something you know better than I.
55 maybe.
Very, very low.
Out of
435, very, very few.
Maybe 50.
But I would come back to the point before that, if we're really serious about oversight, and if it's true, as I think it is, that you get oversight only when you have divided government, that when Congress and the presidency are controlled by the same party, you're just not going to have oversight, period. Then I think we might look to the UK or to Germany, for example, which places control of certain key committees in the hands of the opposition, because they realize that it's not going to be the Madisonian institutional incentive, it will be party incentives. The Conservatives in England have an incentive to ride herd at least a bit on Tony Blair. Members of the opposition in Germany have an incentive to make sure that national security isn't being decided for partisan political reasons. Now, obviously, if you win the House and the Senate, you should get control of most of the committees. But it's a very, very real question whether winning elections should necessarily give the president's own party control of certain committees relating to truly vital interests where where it's very, very important to separate notions of national interest from notions of straight partisan politics. And I think this is a defect in our system because our system is not structured. It was not structured originally, and it's not been modified since then, really to take account of the fact that we live in a party system.
But one of the reactions I have to what Carl is saying, what you're saying, is that there's a big lament about what's going on. I have a friend in Europe who said to me not too long ago, he said, America, look, you got the war you deserved. That yes, it's Bush's war, but it's our country's war. The Democrats and the Republicans collectively in the House and the Senate voted 3-1
That's right.
to give George Bush a blank check to use the U.S. military in Iraq as he deemed appropriate and necessary, which meant he could do anything. So all of us, those of us in the media, and I have castigated myself regularly for not being more aggressive in reporting on things like weapons of mass destruction and so forth. But this is our war, and what fascinates me is that we can't find a way to get out of it, and people are looking for legislation or legalisms. When is somebody going to wake up in the political leadership in this country, whether it's President Bush or Nancy Pelosi or Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, and say, wait a minute, we all did this. Let's at least make an effort at reaching some sort of political consensus and figure a way out. It really is time for a Bill Clinton late night at the dorm, for President Bush to call Pelosi and Reid down and tell them to bring sleeping bags and sandwiches and lots of bottled water, and they're going to lock themselves in the Oval Office, and they're going to see if they can come up with some kind of agreement about where we go. Because you know what we've got right now? Stalemate. And you know what we're going to have until January 20th, 2009? Stalemate, unless somebody can find some way to give a little and sit down and talk with the opposition. I mean, that's the nightmare. And if we can't do that, I agree with my friend who says we've got the war we deserve.
I mean, I agree with you, but from my perspective, this is just more evidence of a defective constitutional system. That if, in fact, we could vote Bush out of, the Congress could vote Bush out of office with the vote of no confidence, or if the Republican Party, if we're more like the Brits, where Margaret Thatcher, by far the most important peacetime prime minister in the history of the United Kingdom, was just thrown out of office unceremoniously by the Tories and replaced with John Major when they came to the conclusion that she no longer fit their party interest or the national interest. My hunch is that if we had a system that allowed votes of no confidence, instead of requiring this whole impeachment sort of talk, that Republicans would be delighted, or a lot of Republicans would be delighted to be the first to replace Bush with somebody they had confidence in. But I think what makes your scenario, however appealing it is, unrealistic, is that the very description you've given of George Bush's psychology makes it extraordinarily unlikely that he will admit that he's not Winston Churchill, that he really has, gotten us, this is Gallipoli, and that what he has to do I mean, in another political system, what he would do is resign. The problem there is that would give us Dick Cheney, and nobody wants that. But in a better design,
Particularly Mrs. Cheney.
right, a better designed political system would provide us a way of talking of getting rid of him, rather than beseeching the great decider to decide differently.
I would like
Get the
to-
last word.
You
I'd
got to
like
go with the Constitution you have.
Yes,
That's right.
And
That's
I
the
mean,
point.
I agree.
It's like what Churchill said about liberal democracy. It's the worst system except for every other one. It's a bad time, but the fact that we have discussions like this, that people are able to realize something is wrong and to go through a period of self-correction, if you stand back and look at it, compare it with how most people live throughout the rest of the world, even in democracies, and how much stability they've had in the last few decades or so, and if you look at our country historically, it gives you a little more pause. And this is where I think Bob's point about trying to understand some of these larger causes. It's a lot of fun to focus on Nixon's psychology and Bush's psychology. But the fact is, as Carl pointed out, people elected them. Why did that happen? People re-elected them. Why did that happen? And so there's something larger here.
I'm sorry, but why did that happen? Our grandchildren, they're going to have videos of Nixon's checkers speech and his resignation speech in 1974. And our grandchildren are going to say, what was
wrong
going
with you
on
people?"
in America?
But-
how could this person become president?
I want to
But he
ask-
did.
With
Question.
43% of the vote.
Let me ask a question of the historians here, and as follows. I have a notion that maybe the problem is even more basic, that we come back to the nature, we talked about a consensus, the possibility Bob talks of a consensus.
Or trying.
To have a consensus, it seems to me, you have to have a system in which people value the truth. Real truth. And I'm interested in whether the historians think that we have devalued truth in our present political culture and larger culture in a way that it has never been devalued in our country before. I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to throw an idea out there because I think that because of, we have been in an ideological state of ideological war going back before the Bork nomination, and we can't even allow the truth of our dead soldiers to be seen by the people coming home in caskets. That this president has made that a blackout, ostensibly, and we know this is not the truth, because somehow it might offend the families of those coming home. My point is that when we reach this point in which truth is so devalued, have we been here before in this country, in our political system, and in the culture at large? I don't know.
Frank?
Well, I think there have been plenty of times where I think the big difference, of course, is there's a lot more information out there, there's a lot more technology to disseminate this information. It's very difficult for people to weigh what is true and what is not true. That's a problem that's always existed. But I would point out in consensus, I just was in Moscow, Vladimir Putin has over 70% approval ratings in Russia, right? And this is someone who has no problem with violence and with lying, with doing all sorts of terrible
That's about
things.
the Russian people, too.
No, it is, but I think it's an important. The fact that we have these sharp divides are often what allow us to discover when people are doing things bad. I don't know that necessarily consensus and everyone agreeing on everything.
The discovery
is,
is there. That's my point. The discovery, look, if you look at the polls, you look at anything else, the numbers are out there. We know. The people in this country know. Bob's just been out there. He said to me this morning, he said, people in this country are up in arms about this war. Well, it's not doing any good to be up in arms in terms of getting a result.
And the point...
Or is it making these people more truthful? So
I mean, the frustration that people feel is we can't redo the Constitution, at least not this week. And there is a dispute about what is true, but it's so pretty clear now, it can't be refuted, that it's been 4 years downhill in Iraq. And I think there's just no mechanism in the system to fix it quickly, and that's why I say it calls for some political leadership, and I think you're right, it would be very difficult, and there's a lot of evidence Bush isn't going to change, but somebody's got to do something. I mean, are we going to be here when Tom Staley has his next Watergate symposium in 2008, again talking about the Iraq War?
Well, yes, because we are.
I'm not coming.
Speaking of, I want to
Let me just finish
Yeah,
one little point here that goes back to something Sandy was saying as well, and Bob, so we know the truth, basically. You know, there's a hardcore 25-30% in the country that won't acknowledge whatever this truth is, and in fact, it is measurable by fact.
Right.
And yet we have a president and vice president who won't acknowledge it. There are enough smart Republicans who also know this isn't true. So the question in my mind becomes, why is it today that, unlike in the Nixon example, those people won't march down to the White House and say, you only had Hagel and a few others out in front enough to say, Mr. President, this is untenable. This has to stop. You have lost our support. Why is it? The Democratic Party was almost willing to do that with Clinton in terms of censuring him on some other stuff. Why, and I'm not sure the Democrats are any better about this kind of thing, but why is it that in something, the great question of our era, these people will not do this?
I think there's a very quick and dirty answer. One is that since there is no mechanism for something like a vote of no confidence, it's basically a plea, and the president has ever greater power to dispense a variety of goodies. Both parties, but particularly the Republican Party, has become ever more centralized with regard to funding elections and things like that. So it really does require a mixture of foolhardiness and courage to do that. And your point, I mean, with Clinton, you can ask some of the same questions. A vote of censure could be viewed as close to the functional equivalent of the non-binding resolution, that it's kind of nice, but it doesn't in fact change the fundamental political reality that he stays in the White House with all of the the prerogatives of the presidency.
Well, let me ask one
I
more
you
question.
need to seize control again.
I've got to seize the podium
Not
here
for me.
because we're running low on time, and it's time really to try to wrap it up. And my proposed question to each of you for your final summations has to do with what not only the events that brought us here, the Watergate events, but also the subsequent events that we've discussed up to and including the current administration and its foibles, what all that offers by way of lessons that should be impressed upon the winner of the 2008 presidential election. And Frank, why don't you start us off?
Just got 5 quick things that I would tell her or him. Don't lie or cheat. Admit mistakes and quickly move on. Don't cover them up. Be humble. Listen to voices outside of your inner circle and get diverse views. And try to make the press your friend. Little is to be gained by making them your enemy.
Succinct and to the point. Sandy?
Well, I agree exactly with everything that Frank said, so I'll happily incorporate that. And it won't be surprising to learn that whoever wins the 2008 election, what I would say to our fellow citizens is that we should think about the extent to which we really do have problems in the structure of our basic institutions. and that the problems we're talking about are not simply the function of personality, are not simply the function of buttering up the press or being more adept in acknowledging error, but that it is time for a long overdue conversation about, you had this in the 70s, this is what the War Powers Act was about, although it hasn't been effective, but we really aren't having a serious conversation, even as we speak, about these more structural issues, because it's so tempting, for very good reason, to talk about the personal aspects of the presidency or kind of political strategy. And for me, obviously, I've now become perhaps obsessed by the extent to which our basic structures are part of the problem, as well as all these other things. But I think Frank's absolutely right.
Fair enough. Carl?
I agree with Frank. I agree with Sandy. But I think that the most important thing that has happened that is a reason for optimism in all of this is that once again, the press has come up with the truth. And that it is, that it really has performed its function. It stumbled a little at the beginning, but almost everything we know about the truth of this presidency, of this war, we know through the press, because they've told almost nothing of the truth. So I would go back to Frank's point about the press, but also I would recommend that if we're going to have real systemic change in this country, it has to begin with young people. And that we need to have a system of universal national service in which every kid in America does 1 or 2 years of some kind of government service, including, you can choose the military or whatever, but institute some kind of draft, because if there was a draft in which most people's kids were in this army, we wouldn't ever get in a situation like this again. But also, all of these structural problems might be addressed by another generation with less cynicism, and that some of that cynicism might come from a couple of years. How many people in this audience are students here? How many of you all would welcome doing national service? Not necessarily in the Army.
You got 4 people.
No, that's
Just 10.
No, I think that's a damn shame.
Yeah.
But that would, I would think, a commission on some kind of national service that really moves toward implementing legislation would be the biggest structural change you could have in this country over time.
Thank you, Carl. Bob, you get the last word.
I'm worried about how we're going to get to 2008. You read about the campaign that's going on, and I think they're going to even dumb it down again.
Yep.
And it is going to be a campaign that, rather than shedding light, diverts light. And that the media environment of cable news and the internet and so forth has so infused the business with 2 characteristics: speed and impatience. We could work on stories for weeks in Watergate. If you get something where we would have a little piece of a story, if you get the equivalent now, somebody's in your office and they're saying, let's get it on the web by 10 a.m.
Do you see what happened today?
Yeah.
Give the example. Tell the example.
Oh, you mean in Politico? Or
No, in the Washington Post.
Oh,
What happened today is that the Washington Post,
You're going to put my newspaper on the report?
They did well by me. I'm an alumnus.
Okay.
They prepared 3 different versions of the story for the web on what, the way I read it,
Yeah.
on whether or not, as a result of his wife's cancer,
Oh, Edwards.
Edwards was going to drop out.
Right.
And on the web, you had to push a button apparently
Right.
when you knew which one it was, and somehow the wrong button got pushed. I'm speaking figuratively, but not.
Right.
And for 51 seconds, the wrong version was up on the web saying he was going to pull out. And there's a big front page web story on the Washington Post site now. But to your point about speed,
So here for 51 seconds.
What the hell is so important about those 51 seconds that you have to be in that kind of position?
Or calling
Thank
the
God
Florida
we
election.
got to type our stories.
That's right.
And we were responsible for all the buttons being pushed.
That's right.
Weren't we? And, no, but the election, instead of being about this speed and impatience, and if I may commend my former partner here, Carl, the issue is character. Who are these people running? Tell me who they are, and it will be easy to vote. And if we have a political media system of covering the horse race and worrying about this and trying to get this poll up faster or this story up faster, we're going to run right by the thing that matters, and that is who these people are. And Carl, to his credit, has a biography coming out on Hillary Clinton, and that will tell you who she is. And that's much more important than who her campaign staff is, or what the latest poll is, or what the latest back and forth with Barack Obama is, and so forth. Who she is the issue. And if we drive journalism away from biography, we truly let down the people. And who knows what we'll come up with in 2008.
On that note,
You do? Very nice. Thank you.